Well, thanks so much for being here. The question I wanted to start out with is, if you had a time machine and you could go back to any time at the Crystal Palace, but only for an hour.
An hour.
When do you want to go back to, and what are you going to do?
See, that's one of the challenges of the Crystal Palace, because it had so much there as the world's first theme park, but also it's actually there for so long. You know? Most people think of the 6 months in Hyde Park, but it was here for 8 decades. So to choose an hour out of those 8 decades is a hell of a challenge. But I would probably have loved to have seen Brock's fireworks. So Brock's fireworks were the weekly extravaganza. And one of the things I think is particularly lovely about those is that it was an opportunity for people to come to the palace that wouldn't ordinarily get to go to the palace. And it was such a local institution. So Brock's fireworks factory was actually based down in South Norwood. And that's where they produced on a huge volume the fireworks would then get displayed at the palace on a weekly basis, but also celebrating dignitaries that visited the palace. So when the Shah of Persia, for example, came along, they would light up his face in fireworks. But they did more than that. They actually had great big displays of battles at sea, and they would have people running along with Catherine wheels strapped to their backs. The kind of thing that I'm not sure health and safety you'd get away with these days. But as far as the spectacle goes, it was wonderful. And all of the crowds used to pack the Italian terraces to watch this. And I think that's one of the things that, for me, I would love to have gone back and witnessed that. And the fact that that wasn't just like a November the 5th occasion, that was every week that they used to put that spectacle on, which just, when you think about the Disney and what they do these days, which people go to and wow, but they were doing this in Victorian times on a weekly basis. Quite special, quite spectacular.
I mean, it sounds so spectacular that, I don't understand what level is like hyperbolic, because it sounds like those fireworks are better than what we do now. So, naval battles, people's faces, like we're doing that with drones now, but with fireworks and over what period, how long did that go on for? Because do we have any photos of it or anything like that?
There are some images of Brock's fireworks. Some of them are in postcards, and you do sometimes see them crop up every now and again, but fireworks, as you probably know, aren't particularly good to capture with cameras, particularly back then. So there isn't anything that really probably does that justice. But just the fact that so many thousands of people would have been touched by the fireworks. And they carried on well into the period where the palace itself had perhaps kind of lost some of its initial glory days. But yeah, for me, Brock's fireworks is definitely what I'd like to go back and see for that hour.
Yeah, I really enjoyed that in the book. Having just finished reading the book earlier, I have to say I'm probably like many of your local readers, where it's very difficult to be unbiased, because it's a literary experience of what we were seeking through going to David's VR. I mean, we forget to a degree how much literature allows you to be immersed in those worlds, and it did what I've always wanted to do, which is to get to go back there and experience it all in this kind of cohesive stream of consciousness, going through the different courts, going up the levels, seeing the surrounding area. It was like, so I'm unbiased because I absolutely loved it, but I've always wanted to go back there. I absolutely love that element of it. And yeah, I guess I wanted to know, what was it that drew you to write this book series set in the Crystal Palace?
Sure. So I grew up in the area. I used to spend my childhood toddling around Crystal Palace Park with my nan. And I always used to love the Sphinxes and the crumbling terraces like phantoms from the past. But the older that I got, the more I realized actually how little I really knew about the Crystal Palace, even though my granddad sold programs at the palace before it burned down, though he always said that had nothing to do with him. But we were volunteering at the subway, which I don't know if you've had a chance to visit the subway since it reopened, but it's one of the last remaining parts of the Crystal Palace that survived the fire. Because it's underground under the Crystal Palace Parade. So it was 2018, and I was volunteering there for an open day. And I was looking at a map of the area, and it was from about 1860. And what really struck me, apart from the scale of the palace, because this was 3 times the size of St. Paul's Cathedral, on one of the highest points in London, but also how much of the area around here, it was still woodland from the Great North Wood. There was still fields and farms all around, as well as all of the villas with a view that were popping up when the palace was relocated here and opened in 1854. But there was one particular point marked on the map which drew my eye, and it said Norwood Newtown. And I was thinking, well, I know West Norwood, Upper Norwood, aka Crystal Palace, South Norwood. I've never heard of Norwood Newtown. So my mum came along a little later with my kids to the subway open day, and she explained that Norwood Newtown was an area where the working class used to live down Central Hill. In fact, just a few moments stroll from where we are now. And reputation had it that there was a wall built around it to keep these ne'er-do-wells away from all of these plush villas that were popping up as people wanted to live in the shadow of the palace. And I just thought that was fascinating and a piece of history that I knew nothing about. And in fact, if you look on your phone, if you look on Google Maps, Norwood Newtown is still marked there today. Or if you get an old school A to Z, it will be there, even though it was demolished a long, long time ago in the 1950s. And so it got me realizing how little I really knew about the area I'd grown up in. And that's when I came up with the idea of a teenager who could time travel back to the heyday of Victorian Crystal Palace through a shattered compass that he discovers in the brambles where the Crystal Palace once stood. And that's why the Crystal Palace Chronicles began.
Yeah. Oh, that's. I now understand the Norwood Newtown connection because, for many people, I think as I said, you'd expect the connection to be somewhere in the opulence of the park and the palace and all that, but to be based kind of like in the working class living area.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's been a lot of work that's been done by the Norwood Society and Stephen Oxford in particular, looking into the research around Norwood Newtown, because it did have a wall on several sides of it, but it is a bit of a myth that the navvies, the navigators who built the Crystal Palace, some people believe that Norwood Newtown was constructed for them to live in, but that actually wasn't the case. Most of them lived down in Beckenham. During the construction. And there's some really fascinating stories about how these navigators set a good example for the wayward boys of Beckenham through their kind of hard work. But the Norwood Newtown wall was constructed for several different reasons. So part of it was for the cottage hospital on one side, but then there was a landlord called Mr. Earl who was constructing some of these lovely villas that we're just next to now, and he didn't want his lovely villas being looked onto by the Norwood Newtowners, so he built that section of wall to section them off. And then you got Rockmount Primary School, which was constructed just at the bottom of where Norwood Newtown was, so it could educate both those locals and locals from elsewhere. But there were all these little nuggets of information that I was learning the more I started to research about the area, because going back to the literature about the Crystal Palace, there's loads of books and settings about the Great Exhibition and the 6 months in Hyde Park. But actually, if you look beyond reference books, the Crystal Palace in Sydenham features almost nowhere. And yet it was here for 8 decades. And it really was the world's first theme park. So you had the first cat shows, the first dog shows, the first aeronautical exhibitions showing the earliest displays of aircraft. That was at the Crystal Palace. The dinosaurs and that whole geographical court. I mean, that was constructed only 30 years after the discovery of fossils. I just blew my mind when I realized that actually those were built so quickly after fossils were first discovered. And I know people giggle about the dinosaurs and their inaccuracy, but let's face it, no one will ever know what dinosaurs really looked like. And probably in 150 years from now, people will watch the Jurassic Park movies and giggle at us. And that's what we thought dinosaurs looked like. But their purpose was to inspire people and to fire people's imagination about what they could have been like. And that was the whole purpose of the palace. It wasn't just a place for education, though, entertainment as well. So you had daredevils like Leona Dare, who came and she rose 2,000 feet, dangling beneath her balloon with just her jaw. And 60,000 people packed the palace over 2 weeks to watch that quite impressive party trick. Again, I'm not quite sure that'd allow you to get away with that today. People like Blondin, who of Niagara Falls fame, who went across on a tightrope, so they invited him to the palace so he could re-perform his trick going across the central transept, which he did, pushing a wheelbarrow with a lion in it. So that's the kind of thing that drew people in their millions. And when we talk about the fact it was the world's first theme park, it actually did include a roller coaster, the Topsy-Turvy. And that was actually run by gravity, and you looped the loop, which is frankly quite terrifying when you think about it. So really, as a force for entertainment, for music, I mean, the Handel concerts that they used to have in the central transept would literally have about 5,000 singers that would perform there, and 1,000 musicians that would perform there as well. The scale of it. Yeah. And you were mentioning earlier about the history that it curated. So if you walked from one end of the nave to the other, it was like time traveling, because along the nave you had different courts that recreated ancient civilizations. So ancient Egypt, ancient Rome, Greek temple. You could go from one end to the other and experience all of that. Of course, it was long before, obviously long before TV, although the palace had its role in developing TV, and Logie Baird in the 1930s had his studios there. But this was even before most people were reading, for example. But you visited the palace, and part of your entry for the day could be to experience these civilizations from the past. Because you've also got to remember this was at the same time as the museums were being opened in central London as a consequence of the Great Exhibition, which helped fund those museums. So again, it was well ahead of its time. It was like, as I said earlier, referencing Disneyland, but instead of Mickey's Castle and Pirates of the Caribbean, you could visit the Abu Simbel statues, for example. Yeah. So a truly incredible place.
Better than Disneyland.
Yeah. Frankly, totally better than Disneyland, because they created everything from scratch.
Yeah.
Because all the stuff that was kind of looted from around the world and showed at the Great Exhibition went to the museums. But for the palace here, if it was constructing something, so ancient Greek marbles, they would recreate it. And the detail that they used to put into that was quite incredible. So the detail that you had, for example, on the Alhambra Palace, and that was Owen Jones who designed that. Such was the detail that they were going to use the plans that he had developed. If everything ever happened to the Alhambra Palace, if there was ever an earthquake or something, that's what they would have used to help the reconstruction of it. And so again, just thinking about the designers, and the minds that gathered together, and also people from all walks of life as well. Because Joseph Paxton, who was the designer of the palace, a guy of very humble beginnings, and he was the son of labourers, farm labourers, but he was also a gardener. Hence the reason it's a bit of a greenhouse. And the fact that he was somebody that drew on the back of a bit of blotting paper an idea for this Crystal Palace to enter the competition after hundreds and hundreds of entries had been dismissed. And he put forward this idea to have a modular built glass and iron construction, the first prefabricated construction ever. And when he put that in, initially there were huge objections that somebody without an architectural or engineering background would have the temerity to suggest that they could put forward this. But not only did it win, it was constructed in record time, under budget, and that was the version that you had in Hyde Park for the Great Exhibition. But then once the Great Exhibition ended, what do you do with this great big glass building in the middle? And there were cries in Parliament, people to pull it down, you can't leave it there. So Paxton and a bunch of his mates who were directors of the new railway companies that were building the new lines that were going down to the south coast came up with the genius plan to take it apart and move it bit by bit and reconstruct it on one of the highest points in London, here on what was Penge Common at the time. But they called it Sydenham. So that's why they hear it referred to as the Sydenham Crystal Palace. But it was even bigger and grander than the original in Hyde Park. And if you ever want to work out the difference between the Hyde Park version and our version, is because the Hyde Park version just had the central transept, whereas the one in Sydenham, that had a transept on either end as well. And again, just to give you the scale of it, the central transept was so tall, you could comfortably fit Nelson's column inside. That's the scale of it.
Yeah.
So if you see a photo and you wonder which one it is, if it's got the flat roof and just one central transept, that's the Hyde Park. If it looks bigger and frankly more beautiful, that's our one.
Yeah.
Wow. This might be a slightly boring question. I don't know, but where did for one, it sounds like it was, a center of innovation, even just the building itself. So it began that way, of this like insane new way of building. But then where did the money come from? Was this like an empire mission of showing off? I know the Great Exhibition was, but then when it came here, where did that? Because I know it was
a private enterprise.
Right, okay.
It was set up by those directors of the railway company with Joseph Paxton as part of it as well. And in fact, he took up residence in a house called Rock Hills, which was right on the corner of the palace. So he could then look at his wonderful design, and you can still see the gates on the corner at the end of Crystal Palace Parade that you could drive into Rock Hills, and the top of those gates are shaped like the transepts of the Crystal Palace. So next time you're walking around that corner, do take a look. It's
Is that where it goes into the caravan?
Yeah,
the caravan park.
Absolutely. Yeah, and the caravan park was where Rock Hills used to be.
I see.
But that was all private. In fact, Joseph Schuster, who was one of the railway directors, he was the guy that owned Penge Place, and that was one of the houses that was roughly in the middle of the park that it is now. If you kind of think I'm right in saying it's round about where the sports centre,
like the old hotels
today. So actually, when you had the Enclosure Act, that started to parcel out in the 1840s, I think it was, different parts of land. And so what was the Great Northwood and what was very much open land around here, different parcels of it were divided up, and Penge Place was built. And Joseph Schuster had that as his home. And he was a director of one of the railway companies and one of the directors of the Crystal Palace. So he sold his house to the Crystal Palace Company, and the land that it was on was developed for the Crystal Palace as the grounds. Now, even though the original was built in record time and under budget, the version that we had here in Sydenham, not quite so much. Because the version that was here in Sydenham, because it was so much grander and because the gardens were so ornate, Paxton being an avid gardener, and created fountains where they shot up taller than Versailles. I mean, incredible, but blew the budget somewhat. So they actually never quite recouped the cost, and it never actually turned a profit because of the costs, and because they were never allowed to open on a Sunday either. Because they were hoping at one point that they would be able to, because most ordinary working people, the only day they got off was a Sunday.
Oh.
And if I've remembered this rightly, initially there was an expectation that because I don't think there was the legislation that we used to have here about these are the particular days you can or can't open. I think there was a possibility that they could have opened on a Sunday, but then it was decided that they couldn't. And so they were then losing all of that income that they could have got. And I think that would have perhaps made the difference. So as grand as it was and as spectacular as it was, it actually never ran a profit until, interestingly, which I learned when I read a program of the Crystal Palace from the 1930s, and Sir Henry Buckland, who was running it by then, pretty much in a trust sort of setup for the public good with private investment. But it finally turned a profit, and was one of the first time in its history that it wasn't losing money, which I personally kind of puts the kibosh on the idea that it was perhaps torched by the owners, because the owners at the time were managing to finally make it break even, and also they'd put so much time and effort into help rebuilding and repairing the palace at that particular point. But there were so many fascinating people that came to the palace over the years. And that's one of the great things about the time travel adventures, that Joe, the hero in the Crystal Palace Chronicles, has an opportunity to meet and become friends One of the people, in fact, the first person he meets when he time travels through the maze and steps out into Victorian Crystal Palace is a boy called Bertie. And Bertie is a big heart and a bit of a big head, but a head full of stories. And stories that when he grew up, this Bromley boy would become the godfather of science fiction, H.G. Wells, who I knew grew up in Bromley. I was aware that that was where he lived in his early years, but I didn't realise the Crystal Palace connection until I started to research the books. Because it turned out that his dad, Bertie's dad, Joseph, as well as being a former servant, again, H.G. Wells from very humble backgrounds, both his parents were domestic servants and they had a struggling shop in Bromley through an inheritance that they had got. But the dad used to spend a lot of his time trying to earn extra income playing cricket. I think in truth, he preferred cricket customers. But one of the places he played professional cricket regularly was the Crystal Palace, including with W.G. Grace, the cricketing legend, who for quite a while was the captain of the cricket team here at the Crystal Palace and helped organise sports. So apparently young Bertie, when he was growing up, used to spend quite a bit of time with his dad hanging out in the Crystal Palace grounds. So when I found that out, I thought, excellent. So one of the people that Joe meets has to be young H.G. Wells. And the more I read about Wells in his early years, the more things started to make sense. So in one of his books, The Time Machine, you have these creatures, the Morlocks. And the Morlocks are these beast-like creatures that live under the ground beneath a sphinx. And you can start to appreciate where he got the inspiration. Our own celebrity sphinxes that we were talking about earlier, where you clambered over when you were younger, as many of us definitely have, and fallen off as well. But that was where he got the inspiration. And you know, he's not alone. There are so many other authors that and creatives that came to the area that were inspired. So Conan Doyle, who again, I was aware he lived for 5 years in South Norwood, but I didn't appreciate that firstly, he wrote more Sherlock stories when he was living in our area than at any other time. But also, it was when he came up with the idea for the Lost World, a land where dinosaurs roam.
Interesting.
And you can probably imagine where he would have got the inspiration from. Our own geological core and the celebrity dinosaurs that we still have today. So there's so many people that have used the area and lived in the area. In fact, Doyle, interestingly, was also he was the president for a couple of years of the Upper Norwood Literary and Scientific Society, and they used to put on lectures. But what was particularly interesting in Doyle's development is that was the start of his interest in spiritualism. And there were quite a few lectures whilst he was president about spiritualism. And so again, the fact that Doyle, who very famously became an ardent spiritualist, that thinking began whilst he was in Crystal Palace, whilst he was living in our area. And so, you know, we talk often about the mystic feel of the area and the sort of remnants of the Great Northwood that was here, and the idea of the Norwood fairies, of myth, and the idea that could have perhaps inspired Doyle, I just find fascinating as well. And so who better to help a hero in a story if they go back in time and they've got adventures to go on than the creator of Sherlock Holmes. So Doyle was another character that I very happily weaved into the books.
Yeah.
That's so cool.
It's a very funny moment, I have to say. This doesn't spoil anything, but where he gives Dr. Doyle his own quote to be about Sherlock Holmes, just offhandedly talking to his friends, saying, once you rule out the impossible, everything what remains must be the truth, no matter how improbable. And Dr. Doyle's there going, that's a very good thing. Where did that come from? He goes, I'm pretty sure you said it in one of your lectures. Yeah, I was just chuckling. I was like, I very much enjoy this.
You can be very playful with the whole time slip scenario, which is a lot of fun.
That's cool. I only knew that Doyle lived here because we almost moved into a building that he lived in, which I'm pretty sure must be around here because it was South London. had the big blue plaque on it, and
was it the Tennyson Road in South Norwood? Was that the one?
It was so many years ago.
Oh,
it might have been. It was a big old building, and this was a tiny flat in that building. But it had big blue plaque said, this is. They were trying to sell us on. This is that's Conan Doyle lives here, but it was a tiny apartment and it was damp, so we didn't move there. But
well, he was a keen cricketer as well, and I think he took a few wickets with W.G. Grace as well. So, it's really interesting the lives that Crystal Palace engaged over the years.
As I understand it, he was a good enough cricketer that he could have been, England professional cricketer if he wanted to be, because there are stories of him having the English cricket team over, and he regularly bowled them out,
Yeah, no, he was a talented sportsman. He was also used to be a goalkeeper for, I think it's Southampton.
In the book, I think you said Portsmouth.
Oh, was it Portsmouth? I knew it was down on the coast.
Yeah.
Wow. No, well remembered. So a man
which again
of many
features
talents.
as a very useful skill there. Won't give anything away, but
no, absolutely. And the other pieces of history that I was learning more about. My family used to live on Romney Road, for example. I'm aware that Romney being the language of the Roma, but my best mate primary school, he lived on Finch Avenue, which just leads off Norwood Park. And I assumed it was finches as in the birds. But again, when I was researching the books, I came across Margaret Finch, the Queen of the Gypsies, and the fact that she had what was known as the Gypsy House, where the train station is today. And people used to come from all over and have their fortune told by her. And the general Roma, when they used to come to this area, that's where they would gather. That's where they would congregate. Again, this is back when it was more the Great Northwood. Samuel Pepys's wife, for example, is diarised as visiting the Norwood Gypsies. And again, what I found really fascinating about Margaret Finch, who of course gave her name to my mate's old road, and that kind of finally clicked, and places like Gypsy Hill. But Margaret was such a legend that when she died, reputedly well over 100 years old, the local landlords paid for her funeral because they were so appreciative of all of the custom that she would draw to the area.
Wow.
And the funeral procession went from here to her gypsy house all the way to Beckenham. And apparently she was buried in St. George's Church in Beckenham. But because she'd spent so many years and she was so old, they couldn't straighten her out. So she was buried in a square coffin. Now, that said, when they did some refurb of St. George's Churchyard in the later Victorian times, they didn't find they were hunting for. But I'd like to think that doesn't necessarily mean that she wasn't buried there. But maybe not in a square coffin. But you still see little keepsakes that are left outside on the lynch gate that's the entrance to St. George's Church in Beckenham, which is actually one of the oldest lynch gates in the entire country. And we've got it just down the road.
Whoa.
Yeah.
And those are some of the other stories that I found fascinating reading about the construction of the palace. I was mentioning earlier about how Beckenham was the place where the navvies, the navigators who built the palace, who used to be responsible for constructing the canals all over the country and the railways. So that's where they had their various lodgings. But in one, it was I think Christmas of 1853, and there was snowfall, which meant that work stopped. But when work stopped, you didn't get paid. So they were facing Christmas without pay, hungry in freezing cold conditions. And when the daughter of the vicar at St. George's found out, then she organised soup making on a grand scale, and so fed the navvies, looked after them, and in fact she became one of the people that really looked after their welfare throughout the whole period of the construction of the palace and making sure that they were looked out for. But also later on as well, when many of them did settle in the area, probably quite a few of them did settle afterwards into Norwood Newtown, even though it wasn't necessarily constructed on their behalf, but possibly around the Beckenham area as well. So you had all of those kind of really remarkable sort of lost characters that I really wanted to weave into the book. So that's another example.
Yeah, I love it. And I've only read the first one and therefore haven't had a chance to get into what is the new series that you are publishing. Is it the second or the third installment of?
So this is the second installment in the Bertie books. So this is Bertie and the War Among the Stars. So the idea with the Bertie books is they're the origin stories of the works that he would write as an adult. So the first of them is Bertie and the Invisible Menace. So as you could probably gather, that is the origin stories for the Invisible Man. And one of the things, again, that I've loved to weave into it are those local, because the basic premise is that Bertie lives in Bromley, which he finds very dull. It's barely a town at that point. What he really wants to do is to come to the Crystal Palace, where the bright lights are and the excitement is, which is a traditional nod to the suburban kids that want to go to where life and excitement is. David Bowie being another Bromley boy as a case in point. So Bert is always desperate to come up here. And one of the places that features quite heavily in the first book, Bertie and the Invisible Menace, is, and I don't know if you recognise it, there's a house on Church Road that always reminds me of the Addams Family house. It's just next to where the Queen's Hotel is. And it's a remarkable house. My brother used to have a flat living directly opposite it. So I thought, yes, that has to be where the Invisible Menace lives. So to be able to weave again those local features and areas in. But then the second installment is Bertie and the War Among the Stars, which, as you can probably gather, is a nod to the War of the Worlds. And the whole premise for Bertie and the War Among the Stars, the excitement kicks off when there's a shooting star that crash lands near Norwood, Newtown, bringing with it something not of this earth. And there's a whole adventure that Bertie and his friends must go on with secret societies and government spies and creatures from outer space. So again, a lot of fun being able to weave in the Egyptian court in the Crystal Palace, where they're looking for clues, but also incredible lives. So one of the key characters in Bertie and the War Among the Stars is Ira Aldridge. So the Aldridge family, they've featured quite a lot within the Crystal Palace Chronicles, but Ira Aldridge was a trailblazing Shakespearean superstar. He was the first black actor to play Othello. He grew up in the States, but then he moved in his late teens over to Britain because he always loved performing, but was fed up with the discrimination that he was facing in New York at that time. And so he was initially the manager of theatre in Coventry, but after the performances, he would give very passionate speeches about the importance of treating everyone equally, and so much so that apparently the people of Coventry petitioned the Parliament to end slavery in dominions, because slavery had been abolished in the UK, in Britain by then, but lots of its dependencies, it was still going on. So he was quite a character. And when he bought a house, he bought his house appropriately in Hamlet Road, which is just a few streets away from the Crystal Palace. And if you're looking at blue plaques, if you walk down Annerley Hill, take a right onto Hamlet Road, you'll see the blue plaque where Ira Aldridge lived in a house he dubbed Lurana Villa, which was named after his mother. But also one of his kids was Lorana as well. In fact, his children were quite creative as well. And one of them, Amanda Aldridge, is one of the key characters that features in Joe's adventures, but also in Bertie's adventures too. So Amanda was a very talented opera singer. And she unfortunately had a vocal she had a throat infection, so she had to quit her singing career, but then became a teacher. And she worked with loads of really talented people throughout the 30s, including Paul Robeson, the American black singer and performer who became only the second black actor to play Othello in the UK. And Amanda, who had been tutoring him vocally, gave him the earrings of her father to wear on stage when he performed Othello, which was just a lovely circle coming of that particular story. But she was also a very talented composer. She performed Buckingham Palace. Lots of her compositions as Montague Ring were performed in silent movies for accompaniment as well. And she was guests into, I think it was called Music Time, which used to be broadcast on the BBC in the 1970s. And when she was well into her 80s, she presented and performed there. So again, another remarkable life, Amanda Aldridge, that was lived in the area that I knew nothing about. And so I really enjoyed weaving in.
Yeah. Well, I look forward to, in a sense, continuing the adventures, and Bertie is certainly an interest. I actually read some of H.G. Wells' short stories in preparation because I thought, well, I'm already reading your book. I'm not sure if I'll be able to do a whole H.G. Wells book, but I'll go through some short stories and thoroughly enjoyed it. And I have to say, being a teacher in schools and seeing so often, this isn't, I don't mean to disparage other authors, but often the books that I end up having to read with year 6 or year 5 or something like that, lack what I feel is that like beautiful, magical imagination of kind of discovery. And I was wondering what your publishing journey has been, because of course it being a children/teen novel, that kind of connection with schools and trying to find it there, but doing it through a kind of indie publishing route. I wonder what you have kind of found from that, because I think it should be in so many schools and so many kids would love reading it, but I understand that's quite a difficult thing to achieve.
Yeah, it's been one of the things I've loved more than anything is going and visiting schools and sharing the books, and also sharing the history of the Crystal Palace. And what I found interesting is I've visited lots of local schools. So I went to Kingswood Primary School, just the other side of Norwood Park, and my mum went there and my granddad went there. So it's going back and then visiting there and sharing my books was particularly lovely. And Rockmount, which features round the corner. And these are kids that, like me, grew up in the area. And so to get that sense of marble is wonderful. But I've also given visits and up in Kilburn secondary schools, further afield than that. I went to Gravesend. They invited me down there for a school visit at World Book Day. They've got no reference to the Crystal Palace whatsoever, apart from a football team, which their emblem still has the palace on it. So, but that's about as far as they probably know about the Crystal Palace, apart from antenna on the distance, our South London Eiffel Tower. But there's just something about the palace. The fact that it is the world's first theme park, the fact that it had all these fabulous people that lived within its shadow, that really captures the imagination. And one of the things that I always invite pupils when I'm doing a school visit is for them to imagine if the Crystal Palace rose again tomorrow, what would you put inside your Crystal Palace? And the ideas that they come up with are wonderful. What features quite a lot is a fire alarm system and sprinklers, which I think is probably a very wise idea given the fate of the Crystal Palace. But lots of it is about sort of time travel, recreating the past, and having it as a place of education for libraries or sport. And so much of what they come up with actually featured in the Crystal Palace itself. Water parks often come up a lot. And there was a water park in the Crystal Palace in the grounds for quite some time in the 20th century. So I think for me, going and connecting with young people is being able to share the wonder that I have, and I know you have, and I think most people have, about the area when they start to discover what used to be here. And as far as being an indie author, I mean, as I mentioned, I came up with the idea in 2018, started to properly develop the idea over those coming months did a lot of research, spent a lot of time hanging around Crystal Palace Park thinking, I could draw this into it. Took my kids with me as well. So my was then 8-year-old. He came up with the idea of discovering a shattered compass in the brambles where the palace once stood. And I thought, yes, we'll have that idea. And then we went to the maze, which had been to many, many times before. But this time we were looking through the eyes of storytellers, which again is one of the things that I encourage younger pupils when I visit, is just look around you and what can give you ideas. And when we were in the middle of the maze, which we'd been to many, many times before, for the first time we noticed these engravings in the centre. And the engravings read, "Follow in their footsteps, pause here a while, listen to the echoes, past, present, future." And we thought, yes, that has to be what Joe, the hero, says when he's found the shattered compass, goes into the maze, says those words, and that's how he transports back to Victorian Crystal Palace.
Yeah.
And so, again, an example of just using your surroundings can really inspire a story, which is, and the other thing that we always say if we visit schools is, everyone has stories in their heads. We're just wired that way. The only difference between a writer and everyone else is that they write it down. And as soon as you do that, you are a writer. And one of the things that I've really enjoyed as an indie author is not having to go through the gatekeepers. I mean, one of the things that I was quite conscious of chatting with other authors that I know is that the middle grade books, it's a kind of a tricky period. I mean, it's one of the reasons why J.K. Rowling was turned down time and again, because people say, make it for younger readers, no, make it for older readers, because we can't really do anything with that kind of readership. And I know with my own kids, there's a real gap because traditional publishing marketing doesn't fill that gap. So I was quite clear that I wanted to go the indie author route. And plus knowing Crystal Palace as I do and knowing those connections, I was pretty sure that I'd be able to share a story that people would want to read. Because that's the other thing. If you go through a traditional published route, you'll get a lot of support for the first couple of months in the publicity, hopefully. But after that period of promotion, that's it. And say book one did well, and then the second book, for reasons that could just be with promotions, timing, whatever it is, didn't do so well, then there would be no book three, even if you've written book three, but nor could you then release book three because you've signed off all of the rights to the publishing company.
Right.
Years before, those rights could revert back to the author over a particular period of time, but they've tightened that up a lot. So you'd have no control over that for quite some time. Yeah. So again, I personally have quite enjoyed being in control of choosing Florian, my fabulous cover designer, for example, which you don't get to do if you're traditionally published. You have no say over your cover, no. And I still work with a professional editor, and that's something that's really important. You still need to make your book as professional as possible, and I'm very proud that it's available in Waterstones. The first Bertie book was I discovered randomly when a friend sent a message when they were in a Waterstones in Canterbury saying, "Oh, look, it's your book." And I'm thinking, I had no idea we were down in Canterbury, and I did a bit of a search on the Waterstones website, and it was available in Bristol, it was available in Bath, it was up in Liverpool, and that feels amazing, especially as an indie author, because I don't have a big publishing house that's behind me, but what I do have is a story that I think people certainly their feedback enjoy, and I think that's one of the very lovely things. And it's not just younger readers as well. One of the oldest readers that I know of was in his 90s, and he remembered the glow in the sky when the palace burned down. But more to the point, he remembered sneaking in a couple of days later with his big brothers and seeing the skeleton of the palace. Wow. But I think one of the most special things that I've enjoyed through being able to go out and promote my books directly is some of the people that you meet when you're at markets. So I've been to the Subway, which is a lovely full circle going back to the place where I came up with the ideas originally. But Christmas before last, I was at a fair in Sydenham, And there was a lady that was at another stall. She came walking around, and I did my normal patter. Do you know about the Crystal Palace Chronicles? And she said, no, but I remember visiting the Crystal Palace as a kid, and I remember watching it burn down. I was 8. That's remarkable. And Pat Cove was her name. And we got chatting further. And so we agreed to meet up, and we were going to record a podcast because her recollections had never been captured before. So we teamed up with Patrick at the Crystal Palace Museum, and they were going to come together with the Crystal Palace Trust as well. And we would get Pat's recollections recorded. And so the day of that recording, it was a Friday. And we were going to record it at the Crystal Palace Museum, an appropriate backdrop. Again, one of the last places that survived the various palace fires. And so Friday morning, I'm driving in to the side of the Crystal Palace Museum because I'm just going to help Patrick set this kind of gear up before going and then picking up Pat, who now lives just up the road in Sydenham. No sooner do I turn in next to the museum, and Patrick comes running out and say, "You've got to reverse. Fire engines are on their way. They're going to need that spot." So there I was reversing, and as I do, these fire engines come charging down, sirens blazing down Annerley Hill, and the museum is on fire. Somebody has broken into the under area. It's always the undercrop.
Yeah.
It seems to be the source of the fire. And fire has been lit. Fortunately, history did not repeat itself on this occasion, and the fire brigade managed to put it out, and the last remnants of the Crystal Palace was fortunately saved. But the really odd thing is, if we hadn't been there on that Friday to record that podcast with Pat, there would have been nobody at the museum.
Oh, wow.
And so the consequences could have been pretty severe. As it is, there was just smoke damage. And so that's why the museum has been closed for the past year and a bit. And it's going to be reopening soon, and with a bit of a revamp as well, which is really lovely. But then meeting Pat a little later, because we carried on, we didn't obviously have the interview in the museum, we had it in the Trust's HQ. And we were chatting with Pat about her recollections of the fire. And she kind of chuckled and said, well, the smell was a bit like you lot, because we had been around. We had that fiery smell to us. But it turned out that Pat not only remembered the fire in 1936, the big one that destroyed the palace. I mean, that blaze must have been such an incredible scale, a building of that size. You know, you can see the blaze if you're out on boats in the English Channel, the glow in the sky. But she was also there in, I think it was 1951, which is when the final part of the palace that had survived, which is I think it was the south wing, it would have been, the little stretch of the palace, like an offshoot of it, that went up to where the Crystal Palace Museum is now, and that's what the School of Engineering that was. There was a fire then, and that destroyed that final section of it. And Pat happened to be passing with her husband then, and she remembered watching it, and then noticed a gentleman next to her and thought, that's a bit odd, he's in his slippers, little monogram slippers. And it was Winston Churchill.
Whoa.
Who had stopped to watch and had famously came up with the quote, it's the end of an era, which indeed it was, the final part of Victorian engineering and ingenuity kind of passing at that point. But it was just incredible that Pat had been there for the 1936 fire, the 1950s fire, and now a fire that almost destroyed the final section.
Yeah.
So I think there's a cold case for Pat, maybe.
Yeah.
You know,
We need to keep her away from
She's very karmically tied to fires in some way. She might save the museum, maybe.
Yeah.
But as I say, had we not have been there,
Yeah.
then I dread to think what could have potentially happen.
And we're sure she wasn't there before you guys.
That's what she
Sorry, she was next to Winston Churchill for the 1936 or the 1951?
No, for the 1951 fire.
Right.
Because although Churchill, and I must admit in my Crystal Palace Chronicles, I've got him at the 36 fire, which many people do, just because I don't go into the 1950s, but I wanted to weave Churchill's little moment in. I've been slightly elastic with some of the facts, which I do say at the end, because at the end of the books, I've got the biographies of all the real life characters that feature in the Crystal Palace Chronicles. So you can learn the facts as well as enjoying the fiction.
That's really cool.
And I thought he was also at the 1936 fire, and that's where he said the quote. Is it not?
No, that was in I think it was the 51. I think it was 51.
I see. Okay. Yeah. Well, yeah, still. And, no, what were you going to ask?
Sorry, can I just ask, because you, as a self-published author and as someone who's just had an incredible idea and a passion, and you brought it all together, because I often think, to be an artist, right, you need, as you said, anyone could be a writer, anyone could be an artist, and you need a drive, but you kind of almost need a almost delusional self-belief, and you've got to look at all the gatekeepers and go, well, who cares about them, and I need to do this. So, I mean, where does that come from in you, do you think? And maybe an add-on to that is sort of, what would you say to anybody who maybe has something, but they're questioning that, and how do you navigate that?
You just got to do it. Get it out of your head and get it down. If you've got an idea, it might sound simplistic, but write it down. And there are parts that will flow, and there are parts that will just plod, and you'll really struggle with. But it's work at the end of the day. Anyone that sort of sits there waiting for the muse to sit on their shoulder and it all flows, they're going to be waiting quite some time. And one of the things that I always encourage people to do is just to get it down. I mean, what helped me quite often is writing the first draft by hand, because you're using a slightly different part of your brain. And I can get it scribbled down, and then I kind of type it up afterwards. And when I have my school visits, kind of what I talk about, as somebody once said, it's write the first draft like a dog and edit like a cat. And I totally understand what they mean, because when I'm getting the first draft down and my tail's wagging and I'm just getting out of my head and onto the page, but then when you edit and rework it, it's slightly more cat-like, and you're thinking a little bit and analysing more, but you've got to get it down. And I think one of the things that struck me when I was writing, certainly the first book, there were moments that I really did struggle with, or reading back, I was thinking, this is rubbish, this particular section. But it's going to be, because that's your first draft. And that's what the redraft and the polishing is. And you work with an editor, so that when your book finally comes out, you don't know the parts that flowed and the parts you struggle with, because it's all as good as it can be. So I suppose that's one of the things that I would always encourage people to not expect to write something that would be what you end up publishing on the page, because nobody does that. Not even Dickens did that. You have to rework it. You need to then redraft it. And I enjoy that phase of it personally. But I also enjoy going out and finding your own readers, because I think one of the challenges with traditional publishing and that kind of gatekeeping is lots of books or book ideas get lost, not because they're bad books, but just because they don't fit the marketing of traditional publishing. I was at an indie author conference, and there was a traditionally published author who had been successful with her thrillers, and she wanted to write lesbian romances with a happy ending. And she was told by her agent and her publishing company, nobody wants to read that. There's not really a market for lesbian romances with happy endings. She thought, I'm pretty sure there is. And so she indie published that series, and it became her most successful series.
Right, yeah.
But because you can go out and you could find your readers directly, you don't have to go through that traditional published route. There are options. Now, what's interesting is that you've often now got indie authors being approached by trad publishing houses and they want to then work with them or republish some of their back catalogue. Whereas it used to be, if you've indie published, there's no chance that a traditionally published company would look at your work. But now traditional publishing is looking for dead certs. That's one of the reasons why you've got so many celebrities and names that they assume will come with a following and therefore with a certain amount of sales. But if you've got publishers that are looking at indie authors who have sold many thousands of books and have got strong followings, they're getting the same thing. And so they're starting to get less snobbish about it and a little bit more receptive to the idea of, and from an author point of view, being a hybrid author. So perhaps a particular series idea you can work with traditional publishing. But again, sometimes that doesn't fit. There was a podcast with an indie author who was talking about how she's had quite a lot of success with one particular series, and she was in conversations, quite extended conversations with traditional publishers about putting it out there, and they wanted to instead of, I think, over 6 books, they wanted to make it over 4. So they wanted her to kind of cut chunks out. She said, but then it won't make sense, and this definitely works because I've got extensive sales to prove it. But because they had a rigid idea of how they wanted to do it, the talks came to an end. And I think that's still one of the challenges with traditional publishing, is that they have a particular way of doing things and they aren't massively flexible. But for me, one of the things I've loved is engaging with local bookshops as well. So Bookseller Crow on the Hill are such a wonderful bunch, and they've always been hugely supportive. I'm really proud. The Star of Nimrod is their best-selling title, and Kirkdale Bookshops and Dulwich Books and Beckenham Books. Those are places that have always been supportive of not just me but other local authors as well. So I think having that local foundation has been something that has meant a lot to me.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the great thing about Crystal Palace, right? It's one of those places where people love to rally around things that celebrate the local. And to be part of that feels wonderful, particularly at a time when, after many, many decades of neglect, Crystal Palace Park is finally, now it's under the trust, getting the investment and the attention it deserves. And as a consequence of that, it means that the history and the heritage is going to be more celebrated. People will understand it more. So again, playing my part in being able to bring it to life, along with people like David recreating the 3D versions and the reopening museum. It's a really wonderful time for the area.
Yeah, and the museum now joining part of the trust as well. Which hopefully, as we talked about on David's side of things, maybe helping to find grants and funding for his work, which would be amazing. And it's funny you talk about the rallying together around, and therefore you understand there's, of course, the other side, which I think you, still living here, get a little bit of that sense of what I think probably the threat that people are afraid of is the triangle local feel area changing. And I think there's been a lot of pushback on the Gales and the Subway and the Nando's coming out. It's like, wait, what's going on? Is this beginning a thing? And so, I think that hopefully that spirit will be able to maintain it from becoming just any old high street around there, because that's what I loved. Also, it being there, still featuring in your books at the beginning of it. It's 1888, but still people are walking around the triangle. They've got the awnings out and all the wares are there. And I thought, wow, that's amazing that it's still going on. All that time ago, which is rather beautiful. But I was going to ask about H.G. Wells specifically, which is obviously him being the father, godfather, grandfather of science fiction. There were two questions, which is, one, what do you think was going on that made him so ahead of his time, that made it so unique, that why weren't other authors this far ahead or thinking these kind of ways, at least at that time? And I think the other bit is there a particular element of science fiction or even just scientific ideas and hypotheses that really grabbed your attention that has to do with these books, or that brought you into H.G. Wells specifically? Because, of course, there are so many characters in The Shadow of the Crystal Palace that you could have gone many directions, but you've gone with Bertie. And I wonder if that came from a specific kind of scientific inquiry and interest.
Yeah. Well, I've got a slight family connection with H.G. Wells in that my great auntie Ivy, she was a maid of H.G. Wells towards the end of his life. And as often happens, it was just a fact that we knew about. None of us ever asked great auntie Ivy about it. Any tales that she might have had about the great man. So sadly, that was lost when she died. But that idea that there was a bit of a family connection is something I've always been aware of. And once I appreciated H.G. Wells' connection with the Crystal Palace, just delving more into his life, and the fact that, as I was mentioning, he was very humble beginnings, the domestic servant, the child of domestic servants. But his big life-changing event that really led him to be the writer that we know was when he broke his leg. And it was just before the summer holidays. And what happened, he was being carted about by one of the innkeeper's son, who dropped him accidentally, and he snapped his leg. So this was just the start of the summer holidays. So he was incapacitated for all that time. But what he did have, thanks to his dad and the Bromley Literary Institute, were books. So he used to bring him books so that he could read whilst he was recovering. And I've got a quote from H.G. Wells, which I can share with you. This was in his autobiography talking about it. So he said, had my leg broken at the beginning... I had my leg broken at the beginning of the long summer holidays in 1874, and I was laid up for some weeks. My father bought me books from the library, The Arabian Nights, The Pilgrim's Progress, Gulliver's Travels, and Aesop's Fables. That accident quite altered the course of my life. I found myself suddenly in a new world, the world of books. That was the beginning of what I might call my real education. And he went on to say, if I had not broken my leg, I should never have written a book. It was the making of me as a thinker. So I think that's something that really struck with me. Mm-hmm. And going back to why he was so influential at that young age, being lost in stories, but also being surrounded with such amazing things like the Crystal Palace that's on your doorstep, and so much innovation, whilst at the same time being very conscious of where you stood in society, which he always was. And when he grew up, he was one of the founders of the Fabian Society, and he was very much somebody that was conscious of the conditions of working people and the concept of a utopia. And, you know, the ideas that he came up with are spectacular, Invisible Men and Martians and Mars. But the reason that we're still making movies of his stories today is because they've got heart. You know, it's about the impact that we have on others, the cause and effect of what we do. And that's what resonates down the decades. I mean, the science part of it and the wonder part of it is incredible, and that is just shows the young lad's imagination. But I think what really sticks is that the way that he presents that in terms of humanity and the choices that we have. And that's why we still go back to his work where we might not necessarily the work of others, for example. So, I mean, one of the books that I've got coming up, The Isle of Dr. Moreau. Is that how you pronounce it? Moreau?
Yeah. Moreau? I don't know.
Which I've just read, which if you're looking for a shorter Wells book, it's definitely worth reading, because that's going to be the 5th in my installment, which is going to be called the Carnival of Curious Creatures, and it's going to tie in lots of because the book itself, a lot of it is about developing animals to become humans, and that whole idea of evolution, and can you speed it up, and what can you do? And it just so happens around here you've got quite a lot of evolutionary figures, because you had Darwin living just up the road, Benjamin Waterhouse Hawkins, who designed the Crystal Palace dinosaurs and lived in Fossil Villa. He did the illustrations from the Beagle tour, and the captain of the Beagle, he lived in Crystal Palace as well in later years. So you've got all these figures that I'm going to weave together into the plot for that particular story. But having just recently read it, it's just so relevant now, that whole idea of man playing God, and what's acceptable in the pursuit of science and progress. Where do you draw the line? Should there even be a line? And those questions are still questions that are relevant today as much as they were back in his time, which is, I think, where you can apply his stories and his ideas in tales today.
Yeah, and it's just so ahead of its time in many ways, because, as you say, it's like there's sort of gene editing as such, not that he would turn it that, but gene editing. There's time travel. There's, of course, the atomic bomb, the nuclear bomb, way before we've got there, and famously, one of the people who worked on the Manhattan Project read that. What's the book? I've forgotten the name of the book that is specifically to do with the creation of this bomb that would burn for days and annihilate cities. And he said only after reading that did he really seriously consider the possibilities of using atomic power for this thing. And you go, oh my God, that's So he was so ahead of his time in just like in terms of the science wasn't even there yet, and it's almost the science caught up to his imagination.
Absolutely.
In that very kind of strange way where you go, why him? Like, what's going on in his life that it's crazy that he was that far ahead, and that even alien battles with alien worlds, like that's
absolutely
insane. So you just kind of look into it, and I wonder if that, as you say in your story, it's his imagination. It's his superpower.
Absolutely. And I think that's what it boils down to, really, for Wells, is that he pushes the idea of imagination and what's possible. And, he also draws on others as well. So you already you did have travels to the stars. There was by Jules Verne, for example. There were still influences. Frankenstein obviously had been around for quite some time by then, in terms of mankind playing God and all of those questions. They were out there, but I suppose what was particularly impressive about Wells is the number of stories that he created that posed sort of similar questions, but in different ways. And I think that is possibly what's kind of made him continue to be relevant, and the fact that his books weren't too long. And I think he really packs in a huge amount of imagination, of tense drama, but he does it in bite-sized chunks, which is again quite appealing to modern audiences as well. No disrespect to Dickens, but you do have to really make an effort to plough through. Whereas I think Wells, one of his brilliant touches is that he considered himself somebody that, yes, wants to let people think and consider and reflect, but he also wants to tell a good old yarn as well, and unashamedly so.
Yeah. It's impressively dense writing. Yeah, I definitely found that from the short stories.
Yeah.
I wanted to be a little bit conscious of time. I was
just about to interject. I had a moment to say it is 11:35, and I'm very conscious that you gotta get going. But this has been so incredible, and I almost want to do another one because I feel like you can keep going for quite a few more hours, and we haven't even got to what is your background and who you are as a person, and how you, I guess, got into writing, then your kids and all those things. That's really good to know as well at another point. But
thank you. Yeah. No, I mean, as I say, the kids played such a great part. So my eldest, one of the lovely things, she came up with the strap line for the Crystal Palace Chronicles, age 10. What if the past became your future? She kind of just came up with that like that. And she's actually designed the chapter headings for the Bertie books as well. Those little graphics that go up the top there. So they're still involved in the books, which is...
Have they been inspired to write their own works or to be inspired by history and where it takes them?
I'd love to say yes. I've sent them on a journey but no, I can't. Their talents lie in other directions, but they do write some quite stories that I've certainly enjoyed. Their creative writing.
They've got creative brains from you. Really.
Well, they certainly have. Yeah. But then so many people do. You know, when I go and visit schools, I think one of the things for primary schools, I mean, you all know this, working with that age, their imagination is limitless. And it is a shame that we've got an education system at the moment that starts to really limit that so heavily as soon as you hit secondary school. And there's more of a focus on the not on the content of what you're writing, but how you're writing, which is which is unfortunate. But I think the longer that we can encourage younger people, I mean, there's people talk about young people not reading, but and there are lots of factors. Not least people talk about phones, etc. And I'm not suggesting that doesn't play its part, but I also think that there is a limit in secondary school around creative writing and being able to get people, certainly when I was younger, kind of writing stories and stuff, there was a lot more freedom, I think, in doing that, which has sort of been lost over time. I mean, even things like drama, most secondary schools these days, unfortunately, don't have, although you do have drama, they've got it on a carousel. So you'll do a term of drama, a term of art, and maybe, I guess, a term of dance. But so you're only doing 12 weeks of drama in an entire year based on 45, 50 minutes worth. So again, in terms of firing imagination, getting younger people creative, I think all of that is all linked in together. So in terms of school visits, if anybody would like the Crystal Palace Chronicles to come to their school, then just let me know, because I really love it. It's one of the privileges of being an author, is being able to connect directly with your readers.
Well, thank you so much, Graham, for being on the podcast. And I hope that everything goes well with the publishing of your latest one, which is coming out tomorrow. Yes,
on Monday, May the 4th. Which
May
seems appropriate for the godfather of science fiction.
Amazing. Where can people go if they want to find
Bookseller Crow if you're local here. If you're more towards Gypsy Hill, West Norwood, then Dulwich Books will have it in stock as well. If you're more Sydenham neck of the woods, then Kirkdale, Beckenham Bookshop will have it. If you're Bromley Way, then Bromley Waterstones, and I'll be having a signing there as well.
And online?
Yeah, I mean, you can get them online. You can get them off Jeff. He's got them available. But I encourage people, if you do like ebooks, is to buy directly from the author. So if you go to my author website, www.grahamwhitlock.com, then you can get the ebooks directly from me. And if it's audiobooks that you enjoy, then I've got audiobooks of all of the Crystal Palace Chronicles, which again, you can get directly from me. And I think buying directly from the creatives rather than Amazon is always to be encouraged if you can't get what you want from your local bookshop.
Yeah, perfect. Well, thank you so much, Graham.
Thank you. It's been a real pleasure. Thanks for having me.
That's great.